Welcome back to the wonderful world of topicality. This video is the second of 3 videos on the topic of topicality. Today's video introduces 2 new types of topicality arguments, effects topicality and extra topicality. So let's get started. You know from the previous video that topicality is one of the stock issues, and you know that it's one of the burdens of proof that must be proven true by the affirmative team. In this case, the affirmative team must prove that we should do whatever the resolution says we should do. But if the proposed plan doesn't match with all of the words in the resolution, then the negative team would argue that the affirmative plan fails to prove that we should do this resolution, and instead seems to prove that we should do some slightly different resolution. But the standard topicality argument assumes that there is a clear violation of one or more words in the resolution, that the plan doesn't really rely on the federal government, or that the plan is not substantial, for example. But it is possible that the proposed affirmative plan doesn't technically violate any of the words in the resolution, but it's still untopical. And there are 2 ways in which this occurs: effects topicality and extra topicality. Let's start with effects topicality. Effects topicality is a type of topicality argument that argues that the affirmative plan attempts to indirectly meet the resolution. In other words, it isn't the plan itself that meets the resolution. It is an effect of the plan that meets the resolution. That the affirmative team proposed a plan in which the federal government contracts the PRISM program to a private corporation, and thus it is a private corporation that is paid by the federal government to operate the PRISM program and report the results back to the federal government. Now, on the one hand, this affirmative would result in a substantial reduction of domestic surveillance by the federal government. On the other hand, the amount of domestic surveillance has not changed at all. It's just shifted to a private company. The problem with this plan is that the curtailing of domestic surveillance by the federal government occurs as an effect of the plan. It's a side benefit that isn't the primary purpose of the affirmative plan. In this case, the federal government rapidly increases the amount of surveillance by a private company, which has the convenient effect of decreasing the amount of surveillance by the federal government. But ultimately, the federal government doesn't curtail domestic surveillance, it simply curtails its domestic surveillance. Let's talk about a great way to test whether the proposed affirmative plan is effects topical, and that's to look at the plan in a vacuum. Looking at the plan in a vacuum means stripping away all of the inherency, harms, and insolvency and advantages, and simply looking at the wording of the affirmative plan. In our example, the plan text is to contract domestic surveillance to a private company. Now, let's look at the plan text closely and ask yourself whether enacting that plan would result immediately or eventually in substantially reducing the surveillance by the federal government. In other words, is the plan itself topical, or does an effect of the plan make it topical? In this example, it is an effect of the plan. The government sells the PRISM program to the private company, but the plan itself does not reduce surveillance. Thus, it is topical only by effect, and that's what makes it effects topical. Now, let's talk about how to structure an effects topicality argument. You already know that a traditional topicality argument requires 4 parts: interpretation, violation, standards, and voters. The structure of an effects topicality argument is very similar, and it begins with the interpretation. As with a standard topicality argument, you will need a definition, also called an interpretation, of a word or words that you believe are violated by the affirmative plan. You don't need to discuss yet how the affirmative team violates this interpretation, because that's the purpose of the next section, the violation. In the violation section of your topicality argument, you should briefly explain why the plan is effects topical and why it violates the interpretation you just offered. You should explain that the affirmative plan is indirectly topical, not directly topical. So it sounds a little bit like this. In subpoint B, we present the violation, and the affirmative plan violates the resolution because it requires the federal government to do something other than curtailing surveillance. In this case, it requires the federal government to pay a company to increase its surveillance. Whether or not the plan indirectly results in a reduction of federal surveillance is irrelevant because the plan must be directly topical. And in the standard section of your topicality argument, you should use effects topicality as a standard. Here you should introduce the concept of the vacuum test and ask the judge to vote for the interpretation that best allows for directly topical plans. It sounds a little like this. Subpoint C are our standards, and we have 3 standards. The first is effects topicality. We believe that the best interpretation of the resolution is the one that requires a plan to be directly topical in a vacuum, which means that the plan text itself should be directly topical by itself. The affirmative plan text is indirectly topical, and in order to be topical, the affirmative team has to include solvency and harms as eventual effects. Note that we said we have 3 standards, so here's your chance to include other standards such as predictability and ground. Now here's a trick. If you know that the plan is clearly affects topical, you should list affects topicality as your only standard. Doing so will make it stand out more. But if you don't think the plan is blatantly affects topical, you can add it as the second or third standard, then blow that affect standard up later in other speeches if the affirmative team drops up standard. Now, that strategy only works in front of highly experienced judges who are keeping a tight flow of the round, and they'll see the argument in the first place, but it's something to think about. And the last section of a topicality argument is voters, which will be almost identical to the traditional topicality argument because it's arguing the same thing, that untopical plans are bad for debate and that judges should not vote for untopical plans. Now, this is especially true if your affirmative team is capturing unfair ground by claiming advantages or solvency from being indirectly topical. A good negative team will point out the imbalance of equal ground. Now, there's one last thing we need to discuss about affects topicality, and that's the line between directly and indirectly topical. Because if we aren't careful in our understanding of affects topicality, every plan could be considered affects topical. Let's say, for example, the plan requires the federal government to limit the use of domestic drones. Well, the plan itself does actually require a few steps to be topical. First, the government has to enact the plan, then the Department of Defense carries out the plan, and then the surveillance is reduced. At first glance, an overeager negative team could claim that this affirmative plan requires a whole lot of steps and is therefore affects topical. However, these steps are all a matter of enforcing the plan, and enforcement details are covered by affirmative fiat. You'll recall from the fiat video that the affirmative team has the power of fiat, which means they're immune from arguments about whether this plan will, could, or would solve. And arguments about whether the plan will actually be enforced are examples of arguments for which the affirmative can claim fiat. So that's affects topicality. And in summary, affects topicality is an argument that claims the affirmative plan is not directly topical, but rather relies on an effect or byproduct of the plan to be topical. The second type of topicality argument we need to discuss is extra topicality. And the extra topicality argument claims that the affirmative plan includes one or more extra elements that are above or beyond the resolution. And this usually results in affirmative teams claiming advantages or solvency that stems from the extra plan element. An easy example would be an affirmative plan that bans warrantless wiretapping and doubles the number of federal judges who can authorize warrants for wiretaps. Now, this extra plan text goes above and beyond what the resolution requires the affirmative team to do, and that extra text in the plan makes the entire plan untopical. In this case, increasing the number of judges to provide warrants is untopical. Kudos to the affirmative team for avoiding the argument that decreasing warrantless wiretaps means catching fewer criminals, but unfortunately, that extra plan step is untopical. Now, there are two ways in which the affirmative plan text can be extra topical. The first is by a plan spike. A plan spike is extra text added by the affirmative team for the purpose of claiming an advantage or solvency, or by spiking out of offensive arguments such as disads. An example of a plan spike would be requiring an increase in federal judges. Now, the second way in which a plan text can be extra topical is through the adoption of a comprehensive plan, policy, or legislation that does more than the resolution requires. Let's say, for example, that the federal government ended the Department of Homeland Security. Now, on the one hand, that would likely curtail domestic surveillance, that's for sure. On the other hand, that would do 1,000 other things that didn't fall under this year's resolution, namely everything Homeland Security does that doesn't have to do with surveillance. Now, a good test of extra topicality is to look at the advantages and disadvantages. If the affirmative team is claiming an advantage from extra plan text, or if the plan text avoids a specific disadvantage, then the extra plan text is probably extra topical. Structuring an extra topicality argument is identical to structuring an affects topicality argument. You'll provide an interpretation that defines the limits of the resolution, a violation that explains how the affirmative plan goes beyond those limits, a few standards, one of which is extra topicality, that explains why the judge should prefer your interpretation, and a few voters that explain why the judge should reject any and all affirmative plans that would otherwise harm the activity if allowed. Okay, that's it for affects topicality, extra topicality, and answering topicality. But before you end, make sure that you understand each of the major terms introduced in this video. Affects topicality, extra topicality, plan spike. Okay, that's all for now. Best of luck, debaters.